History is often written in the blood of those who believe their geography was their destiny. For centuries, the Russian state has operated under the comforting delusion of strategic depth, the idea that the vastness of the Eurasian landmass, the biting chill of the steppe, and the sheer distance from the peripheries would always act as an impenetrable shield. But as I stand witness to the events of this morning, the 8th of May 2026, it is clear that the map is being redrawn, not by diplomats or cartographers, but by the relentless hum of carbon fiber wings and the searing heat of precision strikes. The concept of a safe rear, a sanctuary behind the front lines where the machinery of war can grind on undisturbed, has effectively evaporated. We are witnessing the slow, agonizing dismantling of a superpower's facade, a process that is as much psychological as it is kinetic. The irony is palpable. As the Kremlin prepares its grand displays of antiquated steel for the Victory Day parades, the very heart of its military infrastructure is being systematically gutted. I have spent years analyzing the rise and fall of empires, the shifts in global hegemony, and the brutal reality of power politics, and what we are seeing now is a masterclass in the erosion of systemic deterrence. Last night, the night of May 7 into May 8, the air over the Russian Federation was thick with the scent of burning kerosene and the shattered illusions of the security apparatus. It began in Rostov-on-Don, a city that has long served as a vital nerve center for Russian operations. A critical aviation control center, a facility that serves as the eyes and ears for the Southern Military District, was neutralized. The precision was surgical, the result devastating. As of this moment, more than a dozen airports across the southern reaches of the Federation have ceased operations. The no-fly zone, once a theoretical concept enforced by the state, has now been imposed upon the state by its own failures. From the Black Sea coast to the fringes of the Caucasus, the skies are silent, at least for civilian transport. This isn't just a logistical bottleneck, it is a direct blow to the social contract. Hundreds of thousands of people, travelers, businessmen, and families now find themselves grounded, staring at flight boards that offer no hope until at least the 12th of May. They are being forced to confront a reality that the state-controlled media has desperately tried to obfuscate. The war is no longer a distant broadcast, it is a lived experience. When you cannot fly from your own city because your military cannot protect its own control centers, the myth of the strongman begins to crack. I see the frustration boiling over in the encrypted channels and the quiet whispers in the streets. There is a growing realization that the cost of this hubris is being borne by the populace, and the dividend of this so-called special operation is nothing but isolation and vulnerability. The reach of these strikes is perhaps the most significant development. For years, the Russian establishment relied on the Urals as a physical and psychological barrier. Since the days of the Second World War, when Stalin relocated the Soviet industrial base eastward to escape the advancing Wehrmacht, the territory behind the Urals was considered the ultimate redoubt. It was here that the tanks were forged, the shells were filled, and the strategic reserves were kept in a state of perpetual readiness. But geography is no longer a defense against the democratization of long-range precision. In Perm, a city 1,200 kilometers from the border, the night sky was illuminated not by the stars, but by the inferno of an oil refinery. This facility was once considered untouchable, a vital cog in the Russian energy machine that fuels both the domestic economy and the war chest. To see it burning is to understand that the reach of the adversary has expanded beyond the Kremlin's ability to respond. The people of Perm, who for years watched the conflict through a glass darkly, are now witnessing the consequences on their own horizon. The cynical comments surfacing from the region speak volumes. They finally reached us, they say. It is a sentiment born of a grim realization. The war has finally come home, and it has no intention of leaving. But if Perm was a shock, what happened in Yekaterinburg is a catastrophe for the Russian military-industrial complex. Deep within the folds of the Ural Mountains, in a location specifically chosen for its perceived safety, a massive arsenal of explosives and a production site for fab bombs was neutralized. These fabs, the evil huge bombs that have been used to level entire Ukrainian neighborhoods, to turn cities into ash and memories into tragedies, are now being destroyed at the source. This is the definition of demilitarization. It is not a negotiated settlement or a diplomatic concession. It is the physical removal of the means to wage war. By targeting these facilities, the strikes are killing two birds with one stone. First, they are saving countless lives by ensuring these payloads never reach their intended targets. Second, they are exposing the utter impotence of the Russian air defense network. The S-400S and the Pantsir systems, touted as the best in the world, were silent or ineffective as the drones bypassed the mountain ranges and struck at the very core of the Empire's production capability. The psychological fallout of this cannot be overstated. We are seeing a profound shift in the Russian collective consciousness. The apathy that once defined the Russian public, the I am not political stance that allowed the regime to operate with impunity, is being replaced by a mixture of anger, fear, and a burgeoning sense of betrayal. In 2022, millions may have been swept up in the nationalist fervor, the dream of a restored empire. But in 2026, as the internet shuts down, as businesses close, and as the air raid sirens become the soundtrack of the night, that fervor has curdled. They are not prepared to share the responsibility for a war that is failing on every front. I observed the street interviews in Moscow and Yekaterinburg, and the tone is unmistakable. When asked about the upcoming Victory Day celebrations, the responses are increasingly sardonic. What victory are we celebrating, they ask. It is a haunting question for a regime that bases its entire legitimacy on the cult of military triumph. If the front is crumbling and the rear is burning, the parade on Red Square becomes a funeral procession for an era of hegemony that is rapidly slipping away. This is the reality of the multipolar world in its most violent transition. The old rules of engagement, where a nuclear superpower could dictate terms through sheer mass, are being rewritten by smaller, more agile actors utilizing asymmetric technology. The U.S. establishment and the Western powers often speak of strategic stability, but there is nothing stable about the current trajectory. We are witnessing the fragmentation of a centralized power structure. Even in Chechnya, under the iron fist of Kadyrov, the arrival of drones in Grozny signals a shift. Kadyrov's survival is inextricably linked to Putin's patronage. The moment the center can no longer project strength, the peripheries begin to stir. The visits to military sites in Grozny are a message to the people of Chechnya. The system is collapsing, and the day of reckoning is closer than you think. I see the cracks in the foundation, the way the regional leaders are beginning to hedge their bets, the way the influencers and military bloggers are starting to openly question the logic of occupying territories that have been turned into nothing but ashes. They are asking the right questions, but the answers are ones that the Kremlin is not yet ready to face. The history of the 20th century taught us that evil, when confronted with its own limitations, often resorts to even greater desperation. But the lessons of history also suggest that once the aura of invincibility is shattered, it can never be truly restored. We are entering a phase where the negotiations are being handled by machines, and the terms of the peace will be written in the debris of the old world order. The silence that now hangs over the southern regions of the Russian Federation is perhaps more deafening than the explosions that preceded it. To understand the gravity of what occurred last night in Rostov-on-Don, one must look past the immediate tactical success and examine the structural paralysis it has induced. By neutralizing a single, high-value aviation control center, the strike effectively decapitated the operational capability of 13 major airports. This isn't merely a delay in holiday travel. It is a total systemic failure of a region that serves as the primary logistical corridor for the entire southern front. When the state can no longer guarantee the safety of its own sovereign airspace, the very definition of a protected homeland becomes a mockery. I have watched empires attempt to maintain a facade of normalcy while the edges are being eaten away by attrition, but this is something different. This is the imposition of a modern, technological siege. The hundreds of thousands of individuals who are now stranded, staring at the darkened runways and the canceled flight boards, represent a demographic shift that the Kremlin has long feared. These are not the impoverished conscripts from the distant Siberian villages. These are the urban middle classes, the professionals, and the families of the southern hubs. Their frustration is not ideological, it is visceral. They are realizing that the victory they were promised in 2022 has evolved into a state of permanent insecurity in 2026. There is a grim irony in the timing. As we approach the 9th of May, a date the Russian establishment treats as a sacred validation of its martial prowess, the reality on the ground reflects anything but triumph. The no-fly zone imposed on the South is not a choice made by a cautious civil aviation authority. It is an admission of vulnerability. The Russian air defense network, long touted as the ultimate deterrent, has been exposed as a porous relic when faced with the relentless persistence of small, low-cost, high-precision assets. I find it fascinating from a realist perspective how the drone has become the ultimate democratizer of violence. It bypasses the multi-billion-dollar interceptors and strikes at the soft tissue of the infrastructure. When people ask why this is happening now, after 4 years of a full-scale war that was supposed to last days, they are asking a question that cuts to the heart of the regime's failure. The decision to invade Ukraine was a gamble on the premise that the war could be contained, that the ashes would remain on foreign soil. That gamble has failed. The fire has crossed the border, and it is consuming the very oil refineries and arsenals that were supposed to be the bedrock of Russian resilience. In Perm, the strike on the refinery represents more than just a loss of fuel production. It is a blow to the psychological geography of the nation. Perm sits at the gateway to the Urals, a region that has historically felt insulated from the chaotic tides of European conflict. For the residents of Perm to witness their own industrial heartland erupt in flames is a moment of profound disillusionment. I have analyzed the comments and the social media chatter coming out of these regions, and the tone is shifting from support for the state to survival of the self. There is a dark humor emerging, a cynical acknowledgement that the war has finally reached them. This is a dangerous development for any authoritarian system. A regime can survive hatred, and it can certainly survive fear, but it struggles to survive the loss of its perceived competence. When the populace begins to view the war as a sport where they are the ones losing the points, the social contract is effectively nullified. The drones, in this sense, are indeed the best negotiators. They are presenting a set of terms that the Russian leadership cannot ignore. Either you cease the aggression, or the cost of maintaining it will exceed the value of the regime itself. The situation in Yekaterinburg further illustrates this collapse of strategic depth. The neutralization of the arsenal at Kadrovka is a significant blow to the Russian capability to deploy the fab bombs, those massive, unguided monsters of destruction that have been used to level entire districts. By striking the production and storage sites behind the Urals, the opposition is not just defending territory, they are dismantling the enemy's future. These evil, huge bombs, as the locals have come to call them, are the symbols of a military that has traded precision for sheer brutality. But brutality is a diminishing return. When you destroy everything, you are left with nothing to occupy. Even the most ardent Russian military bloggers and influencers are starting to ask the uncomfortable questions. What is the point of a scorched earth policy if the earth you are scorching is the one you claim to be liberating? This internal critique is a symptom of a systemic rot. I've noted with interest the rise of figures like Ilarion Myslov, who openly proclaim their readiness to fight Putinism without being immediately silenced or imprisoned. This suggests a hesitancy at the top, a fear that a crackdown might spark the very conflagration they are trying to avoid. The fact that these interviews are being watched via VPNs by millions of Russians indicates a hunger for a different narrative, one that doesn't involve the endless sacrifice of Russian lives for the sake of a shattered imperial dream. As the sun sets on the eve of Victory Day, the contrast between the choreographed parades in Moscow and the burning refineries in the Urals could not be more stark. The Russian leadership wants to celebrate a victory that feels increasingly like a relic of a distant past. The world they live in now is one where the defenders of the motherland are finding it harder to explain why the motherland is on fire. The choice facing the powerful is no longer how to win, but how to manage the defeat. The multipolar world is not coming. It is already here, and its first victim is the myth of the indispensable superpower. We are seeing a shift in the global order where sovereignty is no longer granted by historical precedent but earned through technological and psychological endurance. The cynical reality is that in this new era, Peace is not found at the negotiating table, but in the ruins of the industrial sites that made war possible. The question for the Russian people, as they hear the air raid sirens in cities that were once considered safe, is whether they are willing to continue paying the price for a regime that can no longer protect its own sky. The history of the Urals taught us that distance provides safety, but the history of 2026 is teaching us that in a world of connected technologies, there is no such thing as a safe rear. The fire is here, and it is just beginning to burn. The tremors of these explosions are vibrating through the political architecture of the Federation, reaching corners that were once considered politically bulletproof. It is one thing to lose a border outpost in a chaotic skirmish. It is quite another to witness the systematic penetration of the Chechen heartland. Consider Grozny. Ramzan Kadyrov has built a personalized fiefdom on the premise of absolute, subsidized loyalty to the Kremlin, a bargain where internal autonomy was traded for external muscle. But when Ukrainian drones appear over the capital of Chechnya, targeting military sites with the same impunity they showed in Rostov and Perm, they aren't just striking steel and concrete. They are delivering a memo to the local population. The patron is no longer capable of protecting the client. I have long argued that the stability of the Russian periphery is a house of cards held together by the perception of Moscow's overwhelming force. The moment that force is revealed to be overstretched, the cards begin to flutter. In Grozny, the silence of the air defenses during these visits tells a story of a collapsing system. For millions of Chechens who remember the brutal history of their own subjugation, the sight of a drone, a symbol of a different kind of resistance, suggests that the day of reckoning for the current leadership is no longer a distant fantasy. Kadyrov's survival is inextricably linked to Putin's shadow. If the shadow continues to retreat, the man standing in it will soon find himself exposed to the harsh light of history. This erosion of authority is not limited to the restive borders. It is rotting from the inside, fueled by the very weapons the regime claimed would ensure its dominance. The FAB bombs, those massive, unguided relics of Soviet-era philosophy, have become the perfect metaphor for this entire campaign. Heavy, blunt, and devastatingly inefficient, they represent a strategy of pure erasure. When you drop tons of explosives on a city you claim to be yours, you aren't an occupier in any traditional sense. You are a scavenger of ruins. I find it telling that even within the echo chambers of the Russian military-industrial complex, the narrative is shifting. Pro-war influencers and military experts, the very people who once cheered for the annihilation of the adversary, are now asking the most dangerous question of all. Why do we need these destroyed territories? They are realizing that they are not gaining land, they are gaining ashes. They are inheriting tragedies that require billions in reconstruction funds the state no longer possesses. This isn't just a moral crisis, it's a logistical and economic absurdity. The realization that you are burning your own future to secure a landscape of rubble is a realization that can topple a regime more effectively than any foreign army. The ethical contradictions have become so glaring that they can no longer be papered over with patriotic slogans. On the 8th of May, as the state prepares for its choreographed celebration of a victory that happened 80 years ago, the present-day reality is a sequence of nightly panics and air raid sirens. The hypocrisy is staggering. The Kremlin speaks of denazification and liberation while its own citizens in Yekaterinburg and Chelyabinsk are being warned about the consequences of the war their leaders started. I observe the street interviews in Moscow with a mixture of pity and clinical interest. These people, who for 4 years described themselves as totally apolitical, are suddenly finding that politics has a way of finding you when your internet is shut down, when your business is shuttered, and when your children are being sent to defend a line that keeps moving backward. The apolitical stance was a luxury of the era of strategic depth. Now that the depth is gone, the luxury has evaporated. When asked about the Victory Day parade, the responses are no longer scripted. What victory are we celebrating if Russia is losing on all fronts? It is a question that cuts through the fog of state propaganda like a hot knife through wax. Perhaps the most fascinating power mechanism being tested right now is the regime's control over the digital landscape. In an era where information is supposed to be the ultimate tool of statecraft, the Kremlin is finding itself bypassed. People are using VPNs not just to watch Western entertainment, but to access voices like Ilarion Mislov. The fact that Mislov is not in prison, that he is allowed to give interviews on top YouTube channels proclaiming his intent to fight Putinism, is a symptom of a deep hesitation within the security services. In a healthy autocracy, such a figure would have disappeared months ago. His continued presence suggests that there are factions within the elite who are hedging their bets, who recognize that the current trajectory is a dead end. They are watching the same fires in Perm and Rostov that we are, and they are drawing the same cynical conclusions. The system is no longer a monolith. It is a collection of competing interests, trying to figure out who will be left standing when the music finally stops. The geopolitical consequences of this internal fracture are profound. We are seeing a reciprocal response that has moved beyond the battlefield. The drones are not just negotiators. They are the vanguard of a shifting power dynamic where the global south and the multipolar world are watching a supposed superpower struggle to secure its own refineries. This is not the behavior of a global hegemon. It is the behavior of a besieged regional power. The resilience being shown by the adversary is not just a matter of military hardware, but of a superior understanding of modern, asymmetric warfare. They have realized that to defeat a giant, you do not need to match its weight, you only need to sever its nerves. By targeting the aviation control centers, the oil refineries, and the fab production sites, they are conducting a systematic lobotomy of the Russian war machine. As we move toward the 9th of May, the spectacle of the parade on Red Square will feel like a hollow ritual, a performance for an audience that no longer fully believes in the script. The true state of the nation will not be found in the polished armor of the tanks in Moscow, but in the panicked whispers of the people in the Urals who are experiencing the consequences of the special military operation on their own doorstep. The choice facing the Russian leadership is a brutal one: continue the descent into a state of permanent, burning attrition, or admit that the aim of this war was flawed from its inception. But in the world of power politics, admitting a mistake is often the same as admitting a defeat. And for a regime that has staked everything on the myth of victory, defeat is the one thing it cannot afford to survive. The tragedy is that the cost of this refusal to face reality is being paid in the lives of the innocent and the ashes of the very territories they claimed they wanted to save. The historical irony is complete. In its quest to restore a lost empire, the Kremlin has managed only to accelerate the dismantling of the state it already had. The hollow resonance of the Victory Day preparations serves only to amplify the silence of the grounded fleets across the southern reaches of the Federation. It is a profound study in systemic hypocrisy. A regime that worships at the altar of historical military triumph is currently incapable of maintaining the basic infrastructure of a modern state. When 13 airports are shuttered with a single series of strikes, the message is not just for the military commanders. It is for the millions who believed that their silence in 2022 was a shield against the consequences of 2026. This is the moment where the abstract concept of a special military operation collides with the inconvenient reality of a total no-fly zone. I observe the shift in the Russian psyche not as a sudden moral awakening, but as a pragmatic realization of loss. The apolitical masses are discovering that neutrality is a currency that has been hyperinflated into worthlessness. They are angry, not because of the ethics of the invasion, but because the war has finally disrupted the rhythm of their lives, their financial stability, and their sense of domestic sanctuary. This is the turning point where the fear of the state is being eclipsed by the fear of the state's failure. Nowhere is this failure more evident than in the geographic heart of the Russian industrial myth, the Urals. To the cynical observer, the strike on the Kadrovka arsenal near Yekaterinburg is the ultimate debunking of the Soviet-era doctrine of strategic depth. For nearly a century, the Kremlin operated under the assumption that anything placed behind the Ural Mountains was essentially on another planet as far as adversaries were concerned. This was the Asian redoubt, the safe haven where the tools of destruction were forged in the shadow of the mountains, far beyond the reach of European battlefields. But the events of last night have proven that the digital and kinetic reach of modern asymmetric warfare has rendered the Urals just another waypoint on a drone's flight path. The neutralization of the fab production site in Kadrovka is a strategic catastrophe. These fab bombs, these massive, crude instruments of erasure, are the only tools the Russian military has left to advance. They do not occupy. They pulverize. They turn cities into ashes and then claim the ashes. By striking the source of these explosives, the opposition is effectively starving the Russian war machine of its primary method of operation. Without the fabs, the Russian strategy of scorched earth becomes merely a scorched budget.